Construction makers.
We thought we would talk about counterspells and see, sort of their pros and cons and whether or not a card game needs something like a counterspell to function, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that, we see a lot of new card games coming out right now. I think there's a lot of exploration, innovation mechanically. Just quickly, before we get into it, initial thoughts. Pro or con counterspell? There's a right answer.
Pro.
I think I'm leaning towards pro as well.
There's a few different ways to look at a counterspell, right? There's a hard counterspell, which is just counter target spell. There's and then there's sort of like different versions of tempo counterspells, meaning that you're sort of temporarily, that's not what tempo stands for, but temporarily stopping your opponent from doing something. But you're not permanently stopping them from doing it. And I think that those tend to fit sort of the ideology of blue better, which is that it doesn't necessarily have permanent solutions for things. It has temporary solutions for anything, but only temporary. And I would say that tempo-based counterspells, this is things like Mana Leak and also things like Remand, right? So Mana Leak is like a counterspell that only really is functional early in the game, or if somebody's trying to double spell later in the game, where it's counter-target spell unless they pay 3 extra mana. Versus something like Remand, which is...
is that the suspend one?
No, Remand is just return target spell to its owner's hand, and then you draw a card.
Oh, that's right.
So that is sort of the quintessential tempo counterspell. Like it's is a very good card, but in very specific context. And I think the biggest problem with hard counterspells is that they are a permanent solution to any given problem, right? And this starts to creep into other parts of the color pie, mainly black being able to destroy creatures or white being able to destroy enchantments or artifacts. And then suddenly blue, you don't even necessarily need those colors to stop your opponent from doing something. If all of the counterspells in the game were limited to the tempo style counterspells, I wonder if blue would be as powerful as a control color. It's interesting because it would still be quite good, right? There's a lot of card draw and things that sort of a control or economy strategy wants. Mainly with card draw. You do still probably want some early game counterspells to get yourself to the late game, but creature removal specifically might be a better choice in those instances, just because it's still relevant at any point in the game.
Yeah.
Right? So I do wonder if we might see more different types of control decks that may or may not be using blue if it weren't for such hard counterspells. If we look at strategy circle, we can, we have rush, we have economy, we have defense, right? And theoretically counterspells fall solidly into defense. But if we look at them in contrast with a creature removal spell, right? Creature removal falls solidly in defense as well, but it doesn't necessarily work proactively in the same way that a counterspell does.
Yeah.
And the thing that's so unique about counterspells is that they act both as you're stopping your opponent from winning, but they also work as a proactive defense ability, which allows you to stop your opponent from stopping you from winning. And so, we look to high levels of basically any given format, and you'll see that because card quality is so high and sort of combo potential is so vast, that necessary cards like Force of Will end up being sort of the sort of quintessential battle that unfolds in a lot of games. Same thing's true for CEDH as in Legacy, is that understanding the counterspell war that will occur is sort of one of the major play patterns of these formats. The other thing we can see is that in Modern, Wizards of the Coast actually made a ban because of a counterspell. They didn't ban the counterspell, but they banned Violent Outburst because it allowed you to use the counterspell Force of Negation proactively.
Was it for free? Because I'm not as familiar with it, but I saw Violent Outburst as an instant with Cascade 3.
It costs 3 mana and then you cascade. So
Okay.
you'll hit the thing you're trying to hit was something rhino, stampeding rhinos or something. I can't remember exactly what the card was, but it's a card that gives you 4/4 rhinos, 2 4/4 rhinos.
Okay.
And it's supposed to have suspend, but you can just cascade right into it because that's how cascade works.
Okay.
So, but yeah, you are correct that Violent Outburst being an instant speed cascade spell means you can cascade at the end of your opponent's turn, and if they try to stop you somehow, you're playing on your opponent's turn, which means Force and Negation can be played for free because it's your opponent's turn.
Okay.
So you're able to proactively use Force of Negation to protect your own combo win in that instance, which is something that they were seeing as too powerful for the modern format specifically. This is something that also happens in Legacy, but in Legacy, they're seemingly okay with that kind of play pattern. Also happens in CEDH, whatever.
I don't think they're touching that.
Right. They're probably not too concerned with it at this point. But that is sort of the main play pattern in CEDH. Honestly, is that you're going to attempt to win, and you want to be in the position where you're using your counterspells proactively to stop your opponents from stopping you. And if counterspells were limited to being a sort of tempo advantage, I think this would be less of an issue, right? It would still be problematic potentially, but at least you would be able to sort of stop your opponent for a moment from stopping you.
Yeah.
And then after that moment, they would be able to theoretically stop you again, which means you would have to be playing much more proactively, which, I don't know. In a lot of these instances with these combo decks, that might be all they need, right? Maybe that's something why Mana Leak is a little bit better, is that that's not viable throughout the whole game. But something like Remand, Delay fits into this category a bit, Memory Lapse, all these sort of like counter spells that don't permanently get rid of something, but in some instances, Delay is basically just a hard counter spell.
Right.
By the time it gets
suspend, around,
it's over.
Yeah. If it weren't for Counterspell being initially released in alpha, do you think that we'd still be seeing counterspells in this game?
Yes, I do. I don't know if we would. Again, I don't know if we would see
the hard counter, or just the tempo,
counters. Yeah. And the reason why. So a lot of other games that either don't have interaction on your opponent's turn, or they don't have any equivalent to a counterspell, they suffer from like one-turn combo kills, right? Where you don't need to even worry about what your opponent's going to do on your turn, and if you have the ability to just kill your opponent in one turn, you just win the game. There's no resistance to doing that. Magic might not have the perfect solution for this. We'll get into another one that could work instead, but it is one solution to this problem that is pretty good, right? Is that I have a subset of cards that work on your turn that can stop you from winning the game. Right. But then again, they also work for, if I'm trying to win the game, I can stop you from stopping me.
I think the reason that I'm still pro Counterspell is that the skill expression that you get out of Counterspells is, I think, it's just much broader than any other individual card or color, really. And so there's like this chain of sort of events. We talk about levels of heuristics that you might run into. And I think that for counterspells in particular, there's so many chains of heuristics to consider, right? That I think initially the first is just countering a spell, right? And then at that point, it's probably maybe like bluffing to counterspell.
Yeah, I do think that a lot of like counterspells in their incarnation in Magic is a lot of what leads to the majority of bluffing in the. I shouldn't say majority. Like a big part of bluffing in Magic is bluffing a counterspell, right? Two untapped blue mana is notorious for a reason. Right?
Yeah, I think it's probably like if 0 level maybe is acting probably defensively, the next level is acting proactively, and the level beyond that even is probably to understand the when to act proactively, right? It's not just that, I'm going to stop my opponent doing this. It's knowing, is this the card I'm going to stop my opponent from doing this? And I think that is such a huge level to get to understand what cards are necessary for that opponent's deck to function based off the current meta, that it's just interesting that this one card can offer that versatility, right?
Yeah, and I do think you get that with purely tempo counterspells, but you get it. Yeah, I almost want to say that a pure tempo counterspell is, I don't know if there's more skill expression. I would have to think about that for a bit, but I do want, part of it is that it does narrow your window of opportunity, right? Where with like a hard counter is going to be relevant for the whole game. But if you're limited to only tempo counterspells, Memory Lapse, Mana Leak, these kinds of things, your window of opportunity is much smaller. So I think that understanding who's the beatdown, right, in those situations, who has the sort of tempo advantage to win the game, is much more critical when you're using a tempo counterspell. Versus if you're using a hard counterspell, you can kind of fluctuate between those positions. This could be a pro, honestly, of counterspells, is that there's more flexibility in ones that are hard counters, right? Where tempo counterspells are really best early game. And then as you get later in the game, they become less relevant. That dynamic and that understanding how to play a control deck that doesn't play blue is really fascinating. And I do wonder if we would just end up on the flip side of that, right? In that, okay, well, if blue is just not the best answer color anymore, but blue card advantage is still best for control, then we just default to the next best.
Either if you remove counterspells or if you were to give counterspell abilities to another color, would that actually functionally change anything about the game? And I think, yeah, I'm leaning towards probably not, in that it might functionally move the colors around and some of their importance and their functionality, obviously, but they're still just going to be a best color, right? And it's going to be, like you're saying, something that has card advantage or something that has more of those points of interaction that can get closer to the player's decisions.
If you put counterspells in other colors, I think you're right. It doesn't necessarily solve this problem, because then those two colors in combination just become the best control colors probably. Let's say if white had counterspells, it kind of does. Mana Tithe, ironically, is this tempo counterspell that we're talking about, but it's from Planar Chaos, so it was color shifted out of blue, which in blue it's Force Spike. So same card, counter a spell unless they pay 1, and it costs 1 mana. And so there's, I don't know if that necessarily creates a precedent for white having counterspells. There's also a reprint of Raymond that's in white too. I forget what it's called. I think it was from one of the Lord of the Rings sets, but I'll put it on screen. And so we have this precedent for white to have counterspells, but okay, are we just basically then defaulting to white and blue being the best combination of colors for control? Not necessarily. Black still does better at solving problems post them entering the battlefield, but a lot of creatures continue to have more and bigger effects on the board if they enter the battlefield, and so you're putting more and more pressure on solving that problem before it even comes into play.
I was going to say, some of this might be actually somewhat of a reaction, I think, to fire design basically being introduced and trying to see more ETBs, more things of you getting the value of your creatures hitting the board prior to them being removed.
So if you were to make a game that doesn't have counterspells, but you're still concerned with making sure that one turn kill combos don't run rampant, and the game just becomes okay, whoever can just assemble their 1 turn combo first and then just do it. There are some modifications you can make to the structure of the game.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing this a lot right now in card games, is that there seems to be this priority passing system that is, I guess, what we're usually seeing as sort of a microscopic view of the stack every single turn.
It's sort of just playing the game on the stack,
right,
for the whole game.
This is something that Flesh and Blood does, Artifact, Altered,
the Star Wars card game does it.
Star Wars Unlimited. It's very popular, and I think that it's because it's capturing a lot of what people like about that interactivity in Magic. It's very back and forth. There's a mind game to it. It's really interesting. And what's also interesting about it, though, is that counterspells would not really work the same way.
No. Yeah.
But countering a spell is essentially, it's the same as, let's say, using a removal, right? Someone plays a thing on the field. You don't want that thing on the field. Well, on your next turn, in response to the priority being passed to you, you're going to remove that thing.
Right, and bounce spells almost work more like tempo counterspells in this instance, right? Where this thing has sort of come into play, and then you're bouncing it back to their hand or top of their library or whatever, and then that gives them the opportunity to play that card again, potentially. It's pretty interesting. It also means that many more cards can function as sort of counterspells, right? In that the way that this sort of works is I make a move, and commit something to the board, and then you make a move, commit something to the board, and we do this back and forth until we both pass, and then things resolve, just like the stack, right? But that's just how the whole game works. So if the game structures are built that way, then if I can sort of play something that destroys your creature before that creature gets to have its full effect, it gets to function much more similar to a counterspell, which is interesting. I think it is definitely one solution. I will say it's a bit more complicated. There's a bit more stuff to sort of wrap your head around, a little bit more board upkeep because you're sort of doing all the stuff and then resolving it. We see this in CEDH2, right, with such big stacks that now you have to suddenly resolve, and now that's the whole game. So
I think it's tough because it depends on the game, but if the game structure is intended for this, if we're looking at something like Artifact, I think Artifact maybe took it one step too far. Where Artifact
work this way too?
Runeterra also did work this way. Artifact having 3 boards with that system is a bit much. Something like Runeterra, though, like where it's simplified, it's one board as the priority passing system. Even Runeterra had like extra phases that it probably didn't need. If we look at something like, I think Altered is a pretty simple way of looking at this. But Altered is, Altered, it's, you still start, you have a person that actually starts the round, but it's still just a back and forth priority passing until both players pass and decide to basically enact their points and capture whatever side of the field that they're on. But I think that when the game's entire turn structure is built around this, I think that it really is only ever usually on the high end 3 to 6 cards that are being played per turn, meaning it's a pretty small stack.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that when you build your game from the ground up this way, limiting the complexity of individual cards is important, right? Because if cards are doing kind of like multiple things, you can end up with a whole lot of stuff going on that doesn't necessarily get resolved till the end of the round.
Well, I think this is actually why Altered probably opted to have things get removed after each round.
Right, so that the sort of board upkeep doesn't continue to accumulate. Yeah. So you do need some way to sort of limit that possibility space, I think. And that also can be handled through some effects that happen right away, right? Sometimes it's like, okay, I played the thing, I get an effect no matter what, and then if that thing then gets destroyed or whatever before I get the full effect of the card, that's fine. At least I got the initial effect, right? And then the other part of it is like, there's also ways to sort of like segment off the game so that like, well, this thing being over here doesn't affect everything. Any other design takeaways here?
I just like counterspells.
I don't know. I don't want to say they're a necessity or not, right? Because I do think you can build a game that functions without them. I don't think Magic systems function without them at this point, especially not at this point, but even early on.
I think I'm in agreement with you that like, I don't think games necessarily need counterspells. What games really just, I think, thrive on is that interaction. In particular, 1v1 games. I think that there's sort of 2 sides that people have taken when developing these 1v1 trading card games, which is that either everything's going to happen on your turn and you're totally safe, you don't have to worry and you're a little baby, or it's that you should always be afraid because your opponent could definitely do something to you. But I think that in developing those, people, and I think justifiably, have been hesitant to directly go straight to some of the mechanics that Magic has gone to with counterspells, and instead have found these sort of workarounds of, well, how can you capture that feeling that you don't know what your opponent could play next, and that there's that mind game that's happening prior to the unknown information being revealed.
Yeah, it does seem like that Richard Garfield was less concerned with the anxiety that is created by counterspells and more concerned with their sort of viability throughout the entirety of the game rather than just in the sort of like tempo space, right, of things like Remand and Mana Leak. I do think that's something of note, though. There are a lot of players that dislike this anxiety that's created by this kind of interaction, and I do think that a lot of that stems from the fact that Magic exists in 2 spaces, right? They exist in sort of the this is my turn space, and then instants move into this is our turn space. I mean that, there's a difference between like responding out of their hand from unknown information versus responding with known information on the board.
Right? Yeah.
And I do think that there's a hurdle for new players to kind of get over to wrap their head around this sort of counterspell interaction of my opponent has untapped mana. They probably can do something, right? And I think it's a point of growth for players, but if the system was designed from the beginning that's always the expectation, right? That my opponent can always do something because it's a priority passing system, or on the flip side, my opponent can't not do anything during my turn. I do wonder if that's like Magic sitting on that fence in the middle. I do wonder if that's the right place to be or not.
I think I agree. I was going to bring up something very similar, but yeah, I think that it's interesting that Magic does not really tutorialize the stack and instant interactions for players. That's something that you have to sort of start recognizing, and it's very much a mechanical level. If instant spells weren't a thing, then there's not reactions in that way.
I will say it's probably easier for newer players now because they can play things like Arena, right? I remember
Sure.
when Magic Online came out, and I understood the stack, but I didn't like really get it. And then I played Magic Online. I was like, oh my God, what is this game? Like there was a whole leveling up that happened because it was visually illustrated. You know, in Magic Online, you have to like click through every point you pass priority, at least if you don't have any yields turned on. So I remember learning, oh, there's all of these points of interaction that I could be doing something. But without that like visual understanding of the stack and how priority works and things, I don't know if I ever would have made that jump as a competitive player.
And I think that's what's interesting is that like if someone discovering that, knowing that it's there technically, but knowing that it's easy enough to bypass, but learning about that is a deep well of mastery, right? The problem I have is like, is it that we're not showing people the well, right?
Yeah, I do think
is it suddenly less levels of mastery if it's just more front facing? Right. And like, I'm not sure. I don't really know.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is a point of criticism for Magic, and it's something that we have sort of critiqued in other games, where it's like you're obscuring information that should be known just through complexity.
Right. Someone that just knows more rules of the game is going to have an advantage.
Yeah. And you know, like there is something to say for like, okay, well that's part of like climbing the heuristics tree of Magic, but like literally understanding the rules of the game, I do wonder if that's worth it, right? Is it worth it to make the actual rules of the game complex enough that you can play the game without fully understanding the rules?
If you enjoyed listening to us discuss counterspells and why they may be good or bad, I don't know, please feel free to give us a little like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below.
Forrest needs a nappy.
I do. I need a nappy nap. Counter me to sleep.
If you want to tell Forrest to take a nap, you can join our Discord. Link is in the description. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.